Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to be joined right now by Dhaiphong, who is an independent journalist and analyst who hosts a YouTube show under his own name, and he is also co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Danny, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Eleanor.
So I want to start with something that I feel like a lot of listeners might feel confused about because U.S. propaganda. But I was perusing the State Department's website, which I do in my free time, and there's a page called U.S. Relations with Taiwan, and on that page it says, quote, "We do not support Taiwan independence, but it also recognizes them as, quote, a leading democracy." And I'm wondering how you can square that circle. And also the recent upgrade of that relationship. In late July, the Biden administration announced a $345 million weapons package for Taiwan, and it marks the first time that the U.S. has used new authority from Congress to transfer military equipment directly from Pentagon inventory to Taiwan. It's done under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is the same mechanism Washington uses to send weapons to Ukraine. So, Danny, starting with this odd relationship that the U.S. has with Taiwan, can you tell us what exactly is going on there, and what is this recent upgrade, seemingly in aggression via the U.S.?
Sure. So the United States, and if anyone, and I'm sure some of your listeners have been following, the United States has held a long-standing contradictory relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan. On the one hand, if people were following kind of the flurry of so-called diplomatic visits by the United States, from Antony Blinken earlier in the summer to Janet Yellen, to even William Burns, a CIA director, who also announced that the CIA would be revamping its spy program, hoping to get better intelligence on China, ironically or unironically announcing this while in Beijing. The policy that the United States has held with Taiwan has been one of, on the one hand, acknowledging the one China principle whenever it is necessary, meaning that whenever the United States has to actually meet face-to-face with Chinese officials, but on the other hand, in terms of policy and actions, doing the exact opposite. The United States is signatory of 3 joint communiques beginning after Richard Nixon's so-called secret visit, Henry Kissinger's meeting with Zhou Enlai and other Chinese officials at the time in the early 1970s. And one of them, the 3rd joint communique, which was signed in the 1980s, actually states explicitly that the United States would eventually cease arms sales and arms deals to the island of Taiwan as part of upholding the one China principle. Of course, the United States never did that. The United States has continued to supply arms to Taiwan, and China still recognizes this as a complete and utter violation of the one China principle, seeing such arming and such militarization as a clear indication that the United States actually supports the separation of Taiwan from China, meaning that the one China principle has effectively been null and void from the U.S. side. And so this has continued. It's only gotten worse. Each successive presidential administration, from Obama to Trump and now Joe Biden, has continued this policy, and at the same time, rhetorically has attempted to maintain some kind of neutral stance. But the fact of the matter is that each and every time these arms sales and arms deals occur, it is also coupled with equally contradictory rhetoric stating, as you said, Eleanor, that Taiwan is a leading democracy. Of course, during Trump, you had huge pushes to get Taiwan's recognition in the World Health Organization and other international bodies. There is a concerted effort to recognize Taiwan as a separate entity from China, which is in fact a declaration of war, and the militarization certainly doesn't help that. In fact, it is the most escalatory and most dangerous part about this if we just consider what has happened with Ukraine and how the United States essentially has funded and armed several armies for Ukraine in order to fight Russia. And this is admitted by the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The same goes for Taiwan, except in this case, it is even more egregious in some ways because Taiwan is internationally recognized by the United Nations as a part of China, and most of the world recognizes Taiwan as part of China, and the United States supposedly recognizes Taiwan as part of China. And this means that the United States is even more aggressively pursuing what is maybe the most dangerous policy that exists in the world today, because a war between the US and China would lead to absolutely grave consequences for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into that contradictory relationship, because it does seem like the US is trying to do all of things at once. And many analysts have pointed out that the US has tried to backpedal their aggressive stance towards China in some ways, like, throwing the likes of Kissinger on a plane, which, I mean, I hate Kissinger, but that seems like elder abuse. Janet Yellen sending Blinken, in what North Korea's KCNA news agency's Jong Yong-hak called a begging trip to avoid a fatal blow to the U.S. economy. Jong Yong-hak said, quote, "It is the height of the double dealing with impudence peculiar to the U.S. to provoke first and then talk about the so-called responsible control over divergence of opinion," end quote. So I'm curious, what is your read on these recent diplomatic so-called trips to China? Do you think that in some ways the U.S. empire is like, oh, wait, that was really, we went too far? What's going on with that?
I think it's a combination of things, but in the final analysis, in my opinion, it is fake diplomacy, because the United States all throughout this time, regardless of whether it was Janet Yellen coming and bringing a message of, well, we want economic cooperation to continue, or there was Antony Blinken saying that the United States indeed supports the one China principle. All of these diplomatic visits, and then of course you mentioned Henry Kissinger, but it's unclear with Henry Kissinger. I think that the United States probably had some hand, or at least some ear to the ground on why Kissinger was going. Perhaps was actually speaking to Kissinger about how this was an important visit to thaw ties to some degree. But at the same time, the way that Kissinger visit transpired really did send a message that, in fact, the United States, the current administration, the current ruling order, has absolutely no grasp or control over its own diplomatic mission, meaning that the current administration actually can't get anything done because they offer nothing. And that's what has happened over the course of the last several months. I call it fake diplomacy, because nothing has changed policy-wise. The United States has continued the trade war. Janet Yellen made absolutely no ground in eliminating this absolutely counterintuitive and counterproductive trade war, which mainly affects the United States. There has been no let-up of sanctions on China, on its high-tech industry, on 5G, on Huawei, or anything else. And in fact, the Biden administration has just leveled a partial investment ban on China, which is also going to hurt the United States economy. In fact, probably more than it's going to hurt China, despite all of the media hype. When I was in China, a lot of the talk about the economic slowdown globally was spoken more about as inconveniences rather than something that was going to cause devastation. Of course, Huawei, because of the sanctions, they have had to actually scale back the production of their phones to the point where their new phone, I think it was the Huawei Mate 15, didn't have 5G technology, despite the fact that older models across the board did have it. And that was because of the semiconductor sanctions, the ways in which the United States has tried to manipulate the tech industry, the export ban. But at the same time, the United States has actually suffered more from its sanctions, not just on China, but also on Russia. All of this has escalated inflation. It has also dragged the United States economy into backwardness. Much of the United States doesn't have access to a lot of this technology, and most of it is too costly when it is produced by the United States. So the diplomacy between the US and China has been mainly fake from the US side, because it comes with what diplomacy really does involve, which is compromise, which is trying to meet parties halfway, trying to give something while also getting something. That is the definition of diplomacy. And the United States has given nothing to China, making it so that China has had to become more self-reliant. And I think this is both positive, but also it is negative in the sense that self-reliance comes with the need to defend yourself from possible aggression. And that aggression is the dangerous part here. It is the United States continuing the military encirclement, the sanctions, all of these policies. In fact, the United States has been hyping this Russia-China naval exercise that included 11 vessels from China and Russia that was within international waters, but they've hyped it so they can continue their reckless policy, the US's reckless policy of sending warships, not just into the South China Sea, but also through the Taiwan Straits, which happens several times per year. And of course, we know that the United States has invested more than half of its military assets into militarizing this part of the world in order to contain China. So that's where the danger lies, and that's what is not changing despite all of these so-called talks. I have suspicions that these talks are more about getting them out of the way, getting out of the way this kind of global facade, trying to send a message to the world that the US is somewhat serious about diplomacy so that when the 2024 election actually heats up in the United States, the Biden administration and whoever his opponent may be can get back to the business of being so-called tough on China and ramp up these escalatory and aggressive policies toward it.
Yeah, all in the name of our so-called democratic elections. And I want to talk about your trip to China in a moment, but I also you mentioned Huawei and the semiconductor export ban, and I want to discuss that for a minute because I feel like at the core of this, it's about U.S. hegemony and the struggle of a dying empire to try and kick other nations down the ladder as it inevitably falls down itself. And so the TikTok hearings, the semiconductor export ban, it seems like trying to keep China down economically to make sure that China remains a workhorse for the sake of U.S. imperialism, but does not rise above that. Do you feel like that's a correct analysis, first of all? And secondly, do you feel that the U.S. would actually be willing to wage a hot war in order to try and ensure that China stays below it on this ladder?
Well, the latter question may appear difficult to answer, but in fact, we have had many indications from the U.S. national security state itself through leaked memos. For example, Mike Minahan's leaked memo, the top Air Force general, he not only was one of his memos leaked where he said aim for the head when preparing for war with China by 2025, but also he went on NBC News not so long ago, I believe it's within the last month, and he said that he does not take anything back from what he said in that memo. And in fact, the only thing he said in regret to those comments was, oh, he wasn't trying to scare anybody, but we have to be ready. And of course, NBC News, in typical war-mongering stenographer style, all the reporter had to say was, well, are we ready? And that's the mentality, right? That's the mentality that the U.S. foreign policy establishment, really the entirety of the U.S. elite, save for perhaps the unspoken grumblings of certain aspects of the capitalist class, the business class have. It's really a majority opinion that war with China is becoming more and more necessary. So will a hot war occur? It's hard to say. It's hard to say when, but indeed we have major forces within the U.S. national security state preparing for it. And in terms of the policy that the U.S. is pursuing with China, all of it, you're correct, all of it is to try to weaken China, to arrest its development, and ensure that China remains second class to the United States. That ship has really already sailed. So it actually is an effort that is futile. China already leads. You can read the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where they mentioned that China does, out of 2/3 of all of the high-tech sector, the most advanced technologies in the world, China leads them. And that's not even to mention all the other areas that China leads, from poverty alleviation to renewable energy and environmental preservation, to technology as stated, and of course to high class and first class infrastructure. So China is already the world leader in many different areas. Its living standards are rising. People are living longer in China. And the exact opposite is happening in the United States. And what is ironic about the policy that the United States is pursuing, and perhaps this is by design, is that as the United States becomes more and more aggressive toward China, the conditions in the United States actually become worse and worse. And I do think that there is a relationship there. It's not just that the trade war actually is taking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of business and potential investment in the United States that would benefit people, that would give people jobs, that would help people live better. But it's also the fact that the United States is investing trillions in its war machine, trillions of unspoken dollars and undocumented dollars. But of course, we know that the military budget is openly and publicly near $1 trillion, and much of that is going toward this effort to contain China. And with that bloated military budget also comes an investment climate which relies upon military contractors, Wall Street speculation. None of these things, weapons production, financial speculation, none of it lends itself to actually bettering the conditions of people in the United States. And that's why there is a deep relationship between this effort to contain China and the decline of the American empire internally. And that is going to continue. And that is really where I think the huge contradiction lies, and where people can actually start to wake up and see that this isn't working for them. But at the same time, yes, all of the policies, while they're supposed to arrest China's development, actually are having the exact opposite effect. China is becoming more self-reliant. China is investing more in its own capacities because it has to, as well as the fact that China has other options. China isn't isolated. People always talk about Russia being isolated, and of course, that's been proven completely wrong given how it's handled sanctions. But China is on a different level entirely. It's completely integrated in the world economy. The global South supports development with China, supports all of its multilateral institutions and projects. And so when you have 75, 80% of the world's population saying we don't want war with China, it only stands to reason that the US is going to become more isolated the more it pursues this aggressive policy toward China. So that's what's actually been going on. And it is self-destructive in many ways, but at the same time, the mission to ensure that a country like China, a government like China's, an economy like China's, does not become the number one in terms of GDP, in terms of size, in terms of its ability to influence world affairs in a completely different manner, one that isn't hegemonic, but really relies on multilateralism. That is the threat to the United States, and that is one that most, if not all, of the elite in control of US foreign policy just cannot stand to allow to happen.
Well, and so with that, I'm also curious because, the US is a corporatocracy, it's an oligarchy, it's owned by the wealthy. And because China leads in so many important industries that provide billions of dollars to the global economy, is there not some kind of clash inside the United States where you have the rich, especially tech people, pushing for better relations with China while you have war hawks being like, no, let's just, blow them up? Like, is there not that clash? And if so, could the tech dudes win this one for the sake of no nuclear war?
Well, it's interesting. I remember during the Trump administration, there was a letter written to the Wall Street Journal signed by many prominent figures within various sectors of you could call it the corporate elite, but mainly they resided in investment and in tech. But at the same time, their opinions about the matter have been rendered, I wouldn't even call it secondary. They've been rendered mute, I believe, because while on the one hand, these forces definitely want to continue investing in China, and we see that despite the smaller size that trade between US and China has actually undergone, there is a decline in overall trade volume that's been occurring for the last several years. There is still a huge push by these forces to continue to invest in China. I mean, China is a huge market. Across all sectors of the US economy, there's a huge desire to remain present there to ensure that economic decoupling slogan does not pick up steam in real terms. But at the same time, they, as a class, they do not constitute any kind of lobbying force at the moment because, and this is my opinion because I can't get into their heads, but given their lack of pushback, you had Elon Musk, you had Bill Gates take a visit, and that was during this whole summer of so-called diplomacy. And while they went there for their own business interests, they didn't speak so much of US policy. They did, I think Elon Musk did make some reference to decoupling being absolutely out of the question. Maybe both of them did. But at the same time, there is not a concerted effort by people like this to actually stand up to the national security state. And my analysis or my thoughts about that are that, well, they're connected to that military-industrial complex. They are heavily, really indebted to them because a lot of their own investments, a lot of their own profits are tied to the wars, but also to the overall gargantuan military state and national security state that the United States has built. So they're not actually going to stand up to the national security state and say, well, let's cool it on this. Perhaps there are back channels, perhaps there are conversations. I'm sure that there are, but at the same time, when you have other forces, for example, George Soros, who everyone likes to talk about, when you have people like George Soros, but really major factions within the US elite as a whole, when you have them talking about China in this way, when you have this overall political orientation toward China, it speaks to something a bit more existential than the individual business interests or even the collective business interests of a few monopolies. It speaks to the entire order that these monopolies and investors and corporate elites rest upon. It speaks to the fact that China, despite its friendliness and its willingness to cooperate and trade with anybody in order to meet its own national interests, but also to forward a foreign policy of multilateralism, despite how favorable that might be to business and to big business, they do not want to see China's businesses outdo them and eventually gobble up all of the market share, because much of the global south, and indeed, if Europe was allowed to be independent, Europe would be a lot closer to China. The writing is on the wall. China is just doing things better, doing things in a way that actually is more favorable to countries everywhere. And that really scares the United States. And that's why I think that there is tepid, if not weak, opposition among big business, despite the fact it's in their interests to continue to trade with China. Even as conditions get better in China, now you have hundreds of millions of people in China who are willing to buy all of these products. And that's what a capital really needs right now. There's a huge slowdown, a huge investment slowdown. There's an overproduction glut, and you have this huge country with people with a lot of disposable income and with a government willing to regulate so people can afford things and people can buy things. You have that opportunity. But unfortunately, a lot of them are more willing to shoot themselves in the foot than to stand up to the national security state. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.